bar refuses service to man with Harris-Walz hat, then learns he owns the franchise. It was a bustling Friday night at the Harris-Walz bar, a popular chain known for its craft beers and vibrant atmosphere. The place was packed, with patrons enjoying their drinks, chatting with friends, and laughing as music blared in the background. The bar had a reputation for being a local favorite, where people could unwind after a long week. But tonight, things were about to take a turn. At one of the tables near the bar sat James, a man in his mid-30s, casually dressed in a red Harris-Walz cap. He had just gotten off work and decided to stop by for a drink before heading home. He had always loved the atmosphere at the bar. It had a relaxed vibe that made it easy to connect with people, and the staff were always friendly. But as James walked in, he noticed a shift in the usual dynamic. A few people shot him curious glances, their eyes lingering on his hat. He thought nothing of it and went to the bar, ordering a beer. As he stood there waiting, he overheard whispers and snide comments coming from a table nearby. He tried to ignore it, but it was hard to miss the unmistakable feeling that something was off. The bartender, Sarah, was cleaning glasses behind the counter when she caught sight of James' hat. Her expression shifted instantly. She had always prided herself on maintaining a certain atmosphere in the bar, one that was inclusive and free of any political baggage. She had worked hard to cultivate a welcoming environment for everyone, no matter their background. But that hat, there was something about it that immediately struck her the wrong way. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced over at James. He seemed completely oblivious to the tension building around him. The hat he wore, emblazoned with Harris-Walz in bold letters across the front, was a symbol that Sarah found hard to stomach. It wasn't just the hat itself, but what it represented, an association she believed did not align with the inclusive and neutral vibe of the bar. Sarah knew she had to do something, and fast. She couldn't let this slip by. She had worked too hard to make this bar a safe space for everyone, and this hat seemed like a direct challenge to that. Sarah steeled herself for what she was about to do. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined. She walked up to James, putting on a polite but firm expression. "Excuse me," she said, her voice controlled but her tone unwavering. "I'm going to have to ask you to either remove that hat or leave." James looked up, clearly surprised. He blinked twice, trying to process what she had just said. "What? Why?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Sarah took a deep breath. She didn't want to escalate things, but she knew she had no choice. "We try to maintain a certain atmosphere here," she explained, "and that hat, it's just not the kind of thing we want in this space." James furrowed his brows, still unsure of what was happening. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "It's just a hat. I'm not causing any trouble." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice softening, "but it's not about the hat. It's about what it represents and what it might make other customers feel. I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to either take it off or leave." James' face reddened, the confusion turning to frustration. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You've got to be kidding me. It's just a hat. I didn't think it would cause any problems." "I'm sorry, but that's the way it has to be," Sarah said, cutting him off. She didn't like having to make this decision, but in her mind, it was necessary to maintain the atmosphere she had worked so hard to create. James stared at her for a moment, his hand tightening around his drink. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he wasn't about to back down either. He had been coming to this bar for years, and never in all that time had he felt unwelcome. "You're seriously asking me to leave because of my hat?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. Sarah nodded, a look of determination on her face. "I'm sorry, but yes, I've made my decision." James' frustration boiled over. He had been polite and patient, but this felt like an attack. He had no intention of backing down. "Fine. If that's how you're going to treat me, then I'll leave," he said, his voice hardening. He turned to leave, but not before giving Sarah one last, incredulous look. As he made his way to the door, he could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him. Some of them were watching with interest, while others seemed uncomfortable. He couldn't help but wonder if they had been complicit in this, if they had silently agreed with Sarah's decision. But there was no time for that now. He had been humiliated, and he wasn't about to let it slide. But what James didn't know was that his exit would be the beginning of something much bigger than a simple disagreement over a hat. The true story of what was happening in the bar had yet to unfold. The situation was far from over, and the real surprise was just beginning to take shape. James stormed out of the bar, feeling humiliated and disrespected. The weight of Sarah's words lingered in his mind as he stepped into the cool night air. He had never been treated like that before, not by anyone, let alone in a place he had frequented for years. He couldn't fathom why something as simple as a hat had caused such an uproar. He had worn it without thinking twice, not realizing that it would be the catalyst for this confrontation. As he walked down the street, his anger simmered. He didn't understand how a harmless accessory could provoke such a response. But then again, Sarah hadn't seemed to care much for his reasoning. To her, it was about something bigger, something more insidious. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. To him, it was just a hat with the name of the political candidate he supported. But Sarah had made it clear. She wasn't interested in his explanation. Her eyes had been steely, her words cold and unwavering. She had made him feel as if he were the problem, as if his presence in the bar was a disturbance. For what? Wearing a hat? It didn't make sense. He had walked in, ordered a drink, and sat quietly. He hadn't caused any trouble. And yet, there he was, dismissed and thrown out like an unwanted intruder. He could feel the frustration building up inside him, a knot of irritation tightening in his stomach. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was treated as if he were some kind of criminal. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he had been treated this way, or the realization that Sarah's attitude toward him was rooted in something more personal. She hadn't even given him a chance to explain himself. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself as he walked back to his car. His mind raced with thoughts of how to handle the situation. Should he let it go? Should he just forget about it and move on? Or should he take a stand and confront Sarah, demand an apology, maybe even file a complaint? He didn't know what the right answer was, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this slide. The way Sarah had treated him felt unjust. It wasn't just about the hat. It was about the way she had judged him, assumed the worst about him, and dismissed him without a second thought. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just a matter of personal disagreement. This was about respect, about standing up for himself. As he approached his car, he could see his reflection in the window. The anger in his eyes was evident, and he didn't like what he saw. He wasn't the type of person to get into arguments or confrontations, but tonight had been different. Tonight, he had been pushed too far. And now, he wasn't sure how to stop the flood of emotions from spilling over. His hand gripped the door handle, and he paused for a moment. Maybe it wasn't the best idea to let his anger drive him to do something he might regret. But as he sat in the driver's seat and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had crossed a line. It wasn't just about the hat. It was about the way he had been treated, like he was less than human, like his presence was something to be rejected. James knew he couldn't let it go, not this time. He wasn't just going to forget about what had happened. He wasn't going to let Sarah's actions define how he saw himself. But what could he do? He could go back to the bar and confront her, demand an explanation, or he could go to the owner of the establishment and file a complaint. But even as he thought about it, a sense of doubt crept in. Would it make a difference? Would anyone care about his side of the story? Or would they just side with Sarah, chalking it up to some petty misunderstanding? He took another deep breath and pulled out of the parking lot. As he drove away from the bar, he found himself caught in a battle between his pride and his desire for peace. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, but tonight had been different. Tonight, he felt as if he had been wronged, and that feeling wasn't something he could easily shake off. For the next few hours, James tried to distract himself. He drove around the city hoping to clear his mind. But no matter where he went, his thoughts kept circling back to the incident at the bar. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply worn a hat, expressing his support for a candidate. And yet, here he was angry, frustrated, and feeling humiliated. As the night wore on, he realized that he couldn't let this go. He had to stand up for himself. but the question remained. How? Meanwhile, back at the bar, Sarah continued to go about her shift, trying to shake off the discomfort that had settled in her chest. She had done what she thought was right. She had tried to maintain the atmosphere she believed in, one that was welcoming and inclusive. But something about the way James had reacted bothered her. She wasn't used to seeing customers respond like that. Most people, when asked to remove a hat, would either comply or leave without much fuss. But James had been different. He hadn't been angry, just confused, hurt. And now, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. She pushed the feeling aside. She had done her job, and that was what mattered. But still, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, there had been another way to handle the situation. She didn't know what that way was, but she couldn't help but wonder if her decision had been too hasty. For now, though, she tried to focus on the task at hand. The night wasn't over, and there were still customers to serve. Still, in the back of her mind, the image of James' face, the hurt, the confusion lingered. James drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, and the thoughts of how Sarah had treated him at the bar were driving him mad. What had started as a simple night out had escalated into something he couldn't let go. The more he replayed the encounter in his mind, the more frustrated he became. He couldn't understand why Sarah had treated him the way she did. He had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve her outburst. He wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't go around causing drama. All he had done was wear a hat, one that represented his beliefs. But to Sarah, that had apparently been enough to label him as trouble. She hadn't taken the time to even hear him out. She had just judged him based on his appearance and immediately assumed the worst. James slammed his hand against the steering wheel, frustrated. He had always prided himself on being calm, composed, but tonight had rattled him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been humiliated, that he had been dismissed as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. It wasn't just about the hat. It was the principle of it. The way she had spoken to him, her tone dripping with condescension. He wasn't used to being treated like that, and it gnawed at him. He had to make it right. But how? His mind drifted back to the bar, back to the way Sarah had scolded him as if he were a child. It had been unnecessary, cruel even. He wasn't a kid. He didn't need to be told what was acceptable or not. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He had just wanted to enjoy a drink. But she had made him feel small, insignificant, and that was something he couldn't let slide. As James sat in his car, parked in an empty lot, his anger grew more intense. He was tired of being pushed around, tired of people thinking they could dictate what he could and couldn't do based on their own beliefs. He wasn't going to let Sarah's outburst be the end of it. He would go back. He would confront her. He would stand his ground. But even as he thought about it, a wave of doubt crept over him. Would it make a difference? Would she even care? Or would she just dismiss him again like he was some kind of nuisance? His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from his friend, Mark. James unlocked the phone and read the message. "Hey man, you good? I saw you leave pretty quick. What happened?" James hesitated before typing a response. He didn't want to drag his friends into it, didn't want to make a big deal out of something that had already shaken him to his core. But he needed someone to talk to. He needed to vent. He quickly typed back, "I don't know, man. Just got kicked out of the bar for wearing a hat. She went off on me. It was insane." Mark's reply came almost instantly. "What? That's ridiculous. You didn't do anything wrong. You should go back and talk to her." James stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keys. He didn't want to go back, not because he was scared, but because he didn't know if it would even help. He had tried to be reasonable, tried to explain himself, but she hadn't listened. She hadn't cared about his side of the story. All she had seen was a man with a hat she didn't like, and that was enough for her to throw him out. But Mark was right. He hadn't done anything wrong. He shouldn't let someone like Sarah have that kind of power over him. He wasn't going to let it go. He would go back. He would make her see that she was wrong. And maybe, just maybe, he would get some closure. James started the car, his mind made up. He knew he wasn't going to get the answers he wanted tonight, but he had to stand his ground. He had to prove that he wasn't someone who would just let things slide, someone who would just accept being treated like that without a word. He wasn't going to let Sarah get away with it. He was going to make her understand that she couldn't treat people like that without facing consequences. As he drove back toward the bar, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what he would do once he got there, but he knew he couldn't just let it end with him walking away. He would go in. He would demand to speak with Sarah. He would make sure she knew how her actions had affected him. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He wasn't going to be dismissed. He wasn't going to let Sarah get away with this. Not this time. When he arrived at the bar, he parked a few blocks away, taking a moment to gather himself before going in. He had to be calm. He had to make his point without letting his emotions take over. He wasn't going to let Sarah see that she had rattled him, that she had made him feel small. He was better than that. With a deep breath, James got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. He could feel the tension building in his chest. His steps were slow, deliberate. He wasn't going to rush this. He wasn't going to let her see that she had gotten to him. He was in control. As he pushed the door open, he saw Sarah behind the bar, serving a customer. She didn't notice him at first, and for a moment he thought about turning around, walking out. But he couldn't. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything that had happened. James stepped into the bar, his eyes scanning the room. The atmosphere was quiet, with only a handful of patrons enjoying their drinks. It was late, and the usual Friday night rush had passed. The dim lighting cast a warm glow across the room, but the tension he felt was anything but warm. His heart raced as he approached the bar, where Sarah was busy wiping down the counter, unaware of his presence. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The anger that had simmered in him during the drive back was now bubbling up to the surface. He had every right to be there. He had done nothing wrong, but she had treated him like he was an inconvenience, like he wasn't welcome just because of his hat. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. The thought of confronting her sent a surge of frustration through his chest. He wasn't just angry at the incident. He was angry at her blatant disregard for respect and decency. He had tried to be civil, tried to explain himself, but she had dismissed him without a second thought. And now he was going to make her listen. Sarah looked up and saw him standing there, her eyes narrowing immediately. Her face tightened, and the fake smile that had been plastered on her face evaporated. She straightened up from the counter, wiping her hands on a cloth, her posture stiff and defensive. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice sharp. James didn't flinch. "I think we need to talk," he said, his tone calm but firm. She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed. "Talk about what? You've already caused enough trouble for one night." "I haven't caused any trouble," James countered, his voice rising slightly. "I was kicked out for wearing a hat." "A hat, that's it. And I'm here to make sure you understand why that's wrong." Sarah's face flushed with irritation, and she folded her arms across her chest, the confrontation only fueling her irritation. "You're the one who needs to understand. People like you are a problem. You think you can just come in here, wear that hat, and act like it's normal? It's offensive." James felt his frustration spike. "Offensive? You're offended by my hat? What happened to respecting people's differences? You think just because you don't like what I'm wearing, I'm some sort of problem? Maybe you should take your politics elsewhere." Sarah shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is a public space, and people like you make it uncomfortable for the rest of us. If you can't respect the people around you, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." Her words stung, and James could feel the anger in his veins rising higher. The nerve of her. Who did she think she was, passing judgment on him for his beliefs, for his choice of clothing? It wasn't about the hat, it was about her attitude, her belief that she had the right to dictate how others should behave. "I'm not going anywhere," James said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "And I'm not going to let you push me out just because you don't like my hat. I've done nothing wrong." Sarah's expression hardened, and her eyes flicked to the other patrons in the bar, as if seeking validation for her actions. She let out an exasperated sigh and turned back to James. "You think I care about your rights or your opinions?" she scoffed. I don't need to justify myself to you. I have the right to refuse service to anyone I want. And if you can't handle that, then maybe you should find somewhere else to go." James stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his eyes locked on hers. "You don't get to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. That's not your call. You're just another person in this world who thinks it's okay to silence people you disagree with. And you think that makes you better?" Sarah's lip curled in a sneer, her eyes flaring with anger. "You don't get it, do you? You don't belong here. This is my bar. My rules." James wasn't backing down. He had every right to be here, and he wasn't going to let her bully him into leaving. He wasn't going to let her make him feel small for something as insignificant as a hat. This wasn't just about the hat, it was about the principle of it. The way she treated him, the way she dismissed him. "I'm not going anywhere," James repeated, his voice growing firmer, colder. "And you can't keep hiding behind your so-called rules to justify your behavior. It's wrong. You're wrong." Sarah's face contorted with anger, and her hands clenched into fists. "You have no idea what it's like to be around people like you," she spat. "You think you're entitled to everything. You think you can just waltz in here and do whatever you want. Well, not on my watch." James' patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. "You don't get to dictate who belongs or who doesn't. And you certainly don't get to make people feel like they're less than you because of a stupid hat." Sarah took a step toward him, practically trembling with rage. "You think I care about your little speech? You don't scare me. You're nothing but a troublemaker." "You don't know anything about me," James said, his voice low and controlled. "But I'm going to make sure you learn a lesson. You're not getting away with this." He stood his ground, refusing to let her push him out. He wasn't going to let her continue to shout at him, to make him feel like he was the one in the wrong. This wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was a moment of principle, a fight for what was right. Sarah seethed in front of him, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. She wasn't backing down either. The tension between them was palpable, each of them standing firm, neither willing to budge. The standoff seemed to last forever, but neither side was willing to give in. The bartender, noticing the escalation, stepped forward, trying to intervene. But before they could get a word in, James took a deep breath and looked at Sarah one last time. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, before turning to leave. James stood his ground, unwilling to let Sarah's venomous attitude slide. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not after everything that had happened. His heart pounded in his chest, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. This wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about respect, about people like Sarah thinking they had the right to silence others just because they disagreed. "You really think you can just bully people into submission?" James asked, his voice ice cold. He had every right to be here and every right to wear his hat, his beliefs. The audacity of Sarah, acting as though her opinions mattered more than his, was infuriating. Sarah, who had been standing at the counter, threw her hands up in exasperation. Her face was flushed with anger, her expression full of contempt as she glared at him. "I'm not bullying you," she sneered. "I'm protecting the people here. People like you, with your political crap, ruin the atmosphere. You're a walking problem. This is a safe space for real people who respect each other, not for people who think their views are the only ones that matter." James took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Safe space? For who? You or for everyone? You've made it clear you think anyone who doesn't share your views doesn't belong. I'm not the problem here, you are." The tension between them was almost unbearable, and the other patrons in the bar could sense it. Some were starting to glance over their shoulders, watching the confrontation unfold with a mix of curiosity and concern. Sarah, seemingly unfazed by the growing attention, leaned in closer, her voice lowering, filled with venom. "You think just because you come in here with your hat and act like you're better than everyone else, that it gives you some kind of power? You're just a man wearing a stupid hat. And frankly, no one cares about your right to wear it." James' grip on his frustration tightened. Her words were calculated to diminish him, to make him feel small, but he wasn't going to let it happen. Not in his wildest dreams. He wasn't going to back down in the face of her petty cruelty. You don't get to decide who matters, James snapped. You don't get to decide whose opinions count. I'm not here to start a fight, but I sure as hell won't let you push me around. Sarah let out a sharp, mocking laugh, and the patron nearest them shifted uneasily in his seat. It was clear Sarah wasn't even trying to hide her disdain anymore. Push you around? I'm just trying to make sure this place stays civil. And you, she pointed to his hat. You're the reason people like me don't feel safe. James took another step forward, narrowing his eyes. The sheer arrogance she displayed was infuriating. She didn't see him as a person, just an obstacle. But he wasn't going to let her win. I don't need to feel safe in a bar to enjoy myself. People like you always try to control everyone else. You think you're doing a public service by kicking me out? But guess what? The only person you're serving is yourself. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she took a step closer to him. She was no longer hiding her fury. You want to talk about feeling safe, huh? What about all the people who feel unsafe with your views, with your hat? This place isn't a platform for you to express your political nonsense. It's a place for people who just want to relax. I don't care if you're right or wrong. Just keep your crap to yourself. I'm not trying to express anything here, James responded, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the tension. I'm just wearing a hat. But it seems like the only one with a problem is you. You're the one who made this personal. You're the one trying to silence me. Sarah was now standing with her arms crossed, glaring at him as though she were sizing him up. You want to be treated like everyone else, but you're the one that's making this all about you, she spat. You come in here with your hat, and now you think the whole world needs to bend to your whim. Not today, buddy. Not in my bar. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had heard the arguments before, seen people like Sarah try to get their way by twisting reality to fit their narrow worldviews. But he wasn't buying it. He wasn't going to let her use her position, her attitude, to tear him down. You really believe that, don't you? James said, shaking his head slowly. You think just because you don't like my hat, you have the right to dismiss me, to make me feel unwelcome? Newsflash. This isn't your world. You're not the only one who matters. I'm not going to sit here and argue with you, Sarah sneered, stepping back behind the bar as if to distance herself from him. If you don't like it, then leave. You can't come in here acting like you own the place just because you feel offended. James watched her retreat behind the bar, a sense of disgust settling in his stomach. She wasn't even trying to understand, wasn't even willing to listen. She was determined to see herself as the victim in all of this, as if the problem was him, not the way she was treating him. But he wasn't going anywhere, not until she realized just how wrong she was. So, what's it going to be? James asked, his voice low. You going to keep yelling at me? Or are you going to realize you've made a huge mistake? Sarah opened her mouth, ready to retort, but then paused. She looked at him, her expression hardening even more, before turning away. The tension in the bar was palpable. A few more patrons had noticed what was happening, but no one intervened. James stood there, knowing this fight wasn't over, knowing that this moment was far from finished. James stood motionless as Sarah's glare burned into him. He could see the frustration in her eyes, the way she was trying to make him feel small. It was evident that she wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. But as the tension thickened between them, a sense of calm washed over him. He'd been waiting for this moment, the moment when he could finally end the charade and show Sarah just how wrong she was. His phone vibrated in his pocket. James reached into his jacket and pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A simple message from his assistant. They're here, sir. James didn't say a word, his eyes still locked with Sarah's. He could feel the heat of the argument radiating off her, but he wasn't fazed. He wasn't the one on trial here. Slowly, he stood a little straighter, his confidence growing by the second. I think it's time you learned a little something about me, James said, his voice calm and steady. Sarah scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, spare me the lecture. You don't intimidate me, kid. Just take your hat and get out of here. Okay? I'm done with this. James, however, wasn't backing down. He held up his hand, signaling for Sarah to be quiet for just a moment. "You really have no idea, do you?" She sneered, her patience wearing thin. "What do you mean, no idea? I know exactly what's going on here, and I'm not going to stand for it. You come in here with that ridiculous hat, trying to make a statement, and now I've had enough. No one else cares about your politics, so just leave." James sighed, almost pitying her. "You think this is about politics?" Sarah's face twisted in confusion. "Of course it's about politics. What else would it be about? That hat says it all." He shook his head, a small, almost knowing smile curling at the corner of his lips. "It's funny you say that," he began, his tone taking on a different, almost amused quality. "You're completely wrong. This isn't about politics. Not even a little." Sarah's brow furrowed as she crossed her arms, now clearly more confused than ever. "What do you mean? It's literally about your hat. It's got Harris-Walz on it. How is that not political?" James chuckled, his laugh quiet but sharp, like the sound of a knife cutting through the tension. "That hat isn't about politics," he repeated. "It's about something else. You see, the thing is, I own this place." Sarah froze. The words hit her like a ton of bricks. For a brief moment, she couldn't process what James had just said. What are you talking about?" "I own this bar, Sarah. I own every single one of the franchises," James explained, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been yelling at me, trying to force me out of here for wearing this hat. But you didn't even bother to ask who I am. Did you? You just assumed. You assumed that anyone with a different opinion from yours was automatically wrong." Her face drained of color as the realization hit her. She stood there, mouth agape, struggling to process the magnitude of what she had just learned. James could see the shame creeping into her eyes as she started to grasp the gravity of the situation. Her attempt to humiliate him was now backfiring spectacularly, and the weight of her mistake was about to come crashing down. I didn't know," Sarah stammered, her confidence faltering. James raised his hand, silencing her. "No, you didn't, and that's the problem. You assumed that because of my hat I didn't belong here, that my views didn't matter. But you never bothered to get to know me. You let your assumptions control your actions." The bar had gone quiet. The patrons who had been watching this unfold were now silent, their eyes flicking back and forth between Sarah and James. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the moment when the power dynamics completely changed. "I didn't want this to happen, but you made it happen," James continued. "You decided to treat me like an outsider, simply because of what I wore. But let me tell you something, Sarah, you don't get to decide who belongs here. You don't get to make people feel unwelcome just because they have a different opinion." James could see Sarah shrinking, her posture slumping as she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. The bar manager, once so self-assured and hostile, was now visibly deflated. The woman who had tried to control the situation, to silence him, was now being called out for her actions. "You're fired," James said simply, his tone unwavering. "Effective immediately." Sarah blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What? You can't do that. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just trying to—" "No," James cut her off. "You weren't just trying to do your job. You were trying to force your views on me, and that's unacceptable. You failed to see me as a person, and for that, you're gone." The silence in the bar was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. Sarah, now shaking slightly, realized that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had made a terrible mistake, and now she was facing the consequences. "I'll make sure the staff is informed," James continued, turning his attention to the other employees in the bar. "You'll all be hearing from me soon about new policies. We won't tolerate behavior like this from anyone. Not from the staff, and certainly not from the customers." Sarah stood there, her face burning with humiliation. She opened her mouth to say something else, but the words died on her lips. What could she say? What could she possibly say to justify her actions now? "Take a seat, Sarah," James said coldly, his voice carrying no trace of mercy, "and wait for the police to arrive. You're going to need to clear out your things." As Sarah lowered her gaze to the ground, James turned to the bar manager's assistant, motioning for them to take over the operation for the evening. The crowd, still stunned by the revelation, slowly returned to their drinks, the atmosphere charged with a quiet tension. The whole bar had just witnessed the downfall of someone who had thought they could get away with treating others like dirt. But in the end, James had shown them that actions have consequences, and those who think they can silence others don't always get away with it. Sarah's face was pale, her lips trembling as she stood by the bar, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The weight of James's words hung in the air, suffocating her, and her chest tightened as the reality of the situation began to set in. This was it. There was no escaping the mess she had created. Her own actions had put her in this position, and now there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. She could feel the eyes of the patrons burning into her, their gazes heavy with judgment. Whispers rippled through the bar, the once animated conversations turning into hushed murmurs as everyone watched the fallout unfold. Sarah wanted to shrink into the ground, to escape the public humiliation she was now enduring, but it was too late. There was no place to hide. James stood firm, his posture strong and unwavering. He didn't need to raise his voice anymore. The situation had already spoken for itself. The damage was done. Sarah's attempts to assert her authority had crumbled under the weight of her own ignorance and prejudice. And now, she was just a bystander in her own downfall. "James, please, I didn't mean for this to go this far," Sarah finally spoke, her voice cracking, but there was no apology in her tone, only a desperate plea for mercy. She had expected some level of reprimand, but not this, not a public shaming. James turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp and unwavering as he met her eyes. "It's too late for apologies, Sarah," he said calmly, his voice devoid of emotion. "You've made your bed, and now you have to lie in it." A few patrons who had witnessed the earlier altercation exchanged glances, some of them nodding in agreement. The tension in the bar was palpable, but there was a distinct shift. The power had shifted from Sarah's hands to James's. Now, it was his turn to decide what would happen next. "You had every opportunity to handle this situation professionally," James continued, his voice steady, "but instead, you chose to insult me and try to humiliate me over something as insignificant as a hat, piece of clothing. And you know what? That's on you." Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. She realized she had nothing left to say, no excuse that could justify her actions. All she could do was stand there, her shoulders slumped, unable to look anyone in the eye. The other staff members, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, began to gather around. They, too, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. They had seen Sarah's behavior earlier in the day, her condescending tone, and her sharp words. They had witnessed the disrespect she had shown to a paying customer, someone she didn't even know. They had seen her disregard for professionalism, for empathy. And now they were watching her face the consequences. The consequences of letting her biases get the best of her. The consequences of not treating everyone equally, regardless of their beliefs or appearances. James took a step towards Sarah, his eyes never leaving hers. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "This is about every single person you've treated like this in the past. Every time you've judged someone based on their appearance or their views. Every time you've chosen to make someone feel unwelcome. You thought you could get away with it, but now you can't." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her pride still fighting to hold on. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now she saw just how far she had fallen. She had allowed her personal views to cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price for it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though it barely escaped her lips. "I was wrong." James nodded slowly. "Yes, you were. But it's too late for apologies, Sarah. Your actions have consequences." The staff around her watched in silence, some looking uncomfortable, others simply observing. It was clear that Sarah had lost control, and her reputation was beyond repair. What had started as a small confrontation over a hat had snowballed into a complete breakdown of her authority. No one in the bar was looking at her with respect anymore. They were all waiting for the moment when she would be removed from the picture entirely. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. She knew what it was. It was the call from corporate from her supervisor. She had already received the message earlier in the day, the one that told her she was on probation for her behavior. But now, that message would be more than just a warning. It would be the final nail in her coffin. "Sarah," James said, breaking the silence, "I'm calling HR. You've crossed the line, and this is no longer just a matter of a customer complaint. You're done." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had known deep down that this was coming. She had been told before to tone down her behavior, to be more considerate, but she hadn't listened. Now there was no escape. The reality of her actions was sinking in, and there was nothing she could do to change it. As James walked away from her, Sarah stood frozen in place, her heart pounding. The bar, once full of noise and life, now felt suffocating. Her world had crumbled, and she had no one to blame but herself. The patrons began to slowly return to their drinks, whispering among themselves. The silence that had filled the room was slowly replaced with murmurs of disbelief. Sarah had been exposed for what she truly was, a person who thought she could dictate who belonged and who didn't, all based on her own narrow view of the world. But James didn't care about the whispers. He had made his point, and now it was time for Sarah to face the consequences. The fallout was just beginning. In the end, Sarah's encounter with the man in the Harris-Walz hat wasn't just a humbling lesson for her. It was a powerful reminder to everyone around her. Her actions, driven by assumptions and biases, led to a very public and personal downfall. The realization of who she had wronged struck harder than any reprimand could. It wasn't about the hat, the political statement, or the heated words exchanged. It was about the respect we owe each other, no matter our differences. As Sarah processed her mistake, it became clear that true growth comes not from being right, but from acknowledging when we've been wrong. The man, calm and collected, turned a potentially volatile situation into a moment of profound learning. His quiet authority spoke volumes, and in his stead, respect and humility triumphed. In today's world, we often find ourselves facing moments where actions and assumptions clash, leading to a breakdown of understanding and respect. The situation we just witnessed highlights a very real issue: the danger of judging people based on appearances and personal biases. Too often, people react impulsively to something they don't understand, assuming the worst without even attempting to understand the bigger picture. In this scenario, Sarah, the bar manager, allowed her personal bias to guide her actions. She looked at a man, simply wearing a hat that represented his political beliefs, and immediately assumed that he didn't belong, that he wasn't worthy of respect. She could have easily dismissed her assumptions, but instead, she chose to challenge him in front of others, humiliating him without ever considering the consequences. But here's where it gets interesting. What Sarah didn't realize, what she couldn't have known, was that the man she so arrogantly confronted was actually someone who had the power to challenge her. His calm response and the way he took control of the situation weren't just about asserting authority. They were a reminder of the danger in letting personal bias cloud professional judgment. The moment Sarah realized who he was, it wasn't just her mistake that became apparent. It was the weight of her actions. Her pride, her arrogance, and her unchecked assumptions led her down a path she couldn't easily escape from. The momentary discomfort she felt when her world came crashing down was a lesson not only for her but for everyone involved. The truth is, every person, no matter their appearance, background, or beliefs, deserves to be treated with respect. We live in a world where judgment often comes quickly and harshly, but we must remember that everyone has a story, a history, and a perspective. Taking the time to listen, to learn, and to understand before reacting could save us from situations like this. What Sarah learned in that moment, however painful it was, is a lesson we can all take with us. Humility is a crucial part of growth. Instead of seeing others through the lens of our own biases, we must strive to understand them for who they truly are. We should never let assumptions govern how we treat those around us. In a world where political divisions seem to grow every day, it's easy to let differences in opinion lead to conflict. But as we saw here, it's not about the hat someone wears, the political slogan they choose to support, or any other surface-level characteristic. It's about the person underneath. It's about the respect we show one another in the face of difference. So, next time we encounter someone with whom we disagree or who challenges our beliefs, we should remember this lesson. Don't assume, don't judge, and don't act out of a place of anger or fear. Instead, choose respect, choose understanding, and choose to engage in conversation rather than conflict. The moral of this story is clear. Treat others with kindness and respect, not because of what they wear or what they believe, but because they are human. We all deserve that basic level of dignity, and it's up to each of us to offer it freely, without bias or judgment. Let's work towards a world where empathy trumps assumptions and respect leads the way. And remember, the next time you find yourself about to make a snap judgment, ask yourself, would I treat this person the same way if I knew who they truly were? The answer might surprise you. Let's challenge ourselves to be better, to be more understanding, and, above all, to treat others as we ourselves would want to be treated.